The alt-rock group Coldplay did a show at Gillette Stadium in Foxborough, Massachusetts. And during their shows, they feature a kiss cam. And they have a roving camera throughout the audience, and it centers on different people, couples that are kissing or hugging or whatever, and they display it on the big screen behind the band. Well, on this night, they caught this couple, but instead of turning around and leaning in for the kiss, the man ducked out of the frame, and the woman turned her back, and this made everybody in the crowd instantly suspicious. So Coldplay's frontman, Chris Martin, actually pointed it out, made a joke about it. He said, "Look at these two. Either they're having an affair or they're just super shy." And one of the concert goers, Grace Springer, was filming the Jumbotron in case that she and her friends got featured on it. And so she kept that video, and actually when she got home, she posted it online. And the video went viral. Who were the Kiss Cam couple? It didn't take long for people on the internet to figure it out. He was Andy Byron, a CEO of a New York-based AI firm called Astronomer, and she was Kristen Cabot, a direct report of his, who was called, they called her the chief people officer in the company, and they were married, but as you could probably guess, not to each other. And that's why they scrambled to hide their faces when they realized they were on camera. But now it's all over the internet. Next, the press picked up the story. And this, by the way, this picture is from Australia. That's how quickly and widely this story has spread. By day 2 of the scandal, both Byron and Cabot were on leave, and then just a few days later, both of them resigned from their positions. Their private moment became a public moment, and it did not go very well for them. Well, just last week, if you remember, the sermon was about John 8, the story where Jesus encounters a woman caught in adultery, and people were wanting to stone her, and you remember what Jesus said? His words there are good for us to be reminded of this morning. He says, "Whoever of you is without sin, you go ahead and cast the first stone." Because think about this. I mean, imagine somebody was following you all week, maybe for a month, filming everything. And if you do anything or say anything that's kind of bad, that gets posted online. I wonder how many of us would survive that kind of coverage. Or imagine that someone is doing a story about you and wants to find some dirt on you, and so they go through your life with a fine-tooth comb. They go through all your financial records. They interview family members, classmates, people you work with, old girlfriends, old boyfriends, looking for any flaws, any sort of newsworthy, immoral thing or unethical thing that you've done. Not many of us, I don't think, would withstand that kind of, being under the microscope like that. A lot of us have things in our lives, maybe experiences in the past, that we don't want people to know about. We call them skeletons in the closet. Family secrets, indiscretions, scandalous sins, whatever you want to call them. We've got these skeletons in the closet, and we're trying to hide them. Joel was talking about sort of old school stuff. There's a little bit of an old school movie. Do you remember the movie I Know What You Did Last Summer? It's a story about 4 teenage friends who accidentally run somebody over, and instead of going public with it or bringing it to the police, they covered it up. And then they get this cryptic message, "I know what you did last summer." Well, I suspect a lot of people would get nervous if someone said to them, "I know what you did last summer," because we probably did something last summer that we don't want people to know about. Well, maybe you've heard of this guy, Arthur Conan Doyle. He was the author of the Sherlock Holmes mysteries back in the day, in the 18th century. And besides having an amazing mustache, he was a great author, but he also was a practical joker. And so one time, as a joke, he sent an anonymous telegram to 4 of his friends. This is back, they had telegrams then. He sent this telegram, short, anonymous telegram that said, "All is discovered. Flee at once." Within 24 hours, all of his friends had left the country. So most of us have skeletons in the closet. Unresolved guilt. Some things, plural, that we're ashamed of, and we live in fear that it's going to get found out. And these skeletons rob us of joy, they rob us of peace, they damage our relationships, they keep us from being genuine and honest with everybody. And so our relationships then stay at a certain level. There's a certain amount of superficiality about it because we're afraid that if people know, we keep it behind our back because we're afraid if people know the truth about us, then they're not going to love us anymore. They're not going to want to be friends with us anymore. So what do we do about these skeletons in the closet? Well, the Bible tells us about one man's skeleton in the closet. It's a terrible secret. It's almost unimaginable, especially when you think about who did it. And the background here, this is the background of Psalm 32. We are talking about Psalm 32 today. The story behind it comes from 2 Samuel 11 and 12. And some of you have heard this before, so I'll give you the short version of the background. So David has been the king of Israel for a long time. And there's a season that apparently that kind of regularly, that's when the armies would go out and do battle against each other. And this particular season, he decides to just stay home. And he's hanging out at his home, and he sees this woman, and he calls her to him, and they do what men and women sometimes do. And a few weeks later, she's pregnant. They find out that she's pregnant, which creates a crisis because her husband is a military guy, and he's gone. And so unless, people are going to know that he is not the father, and it's going to be a problem. And so David's solution is to call for this guy, his name is Uriah, and he calls him home from the battle lines and encourages him to go home and spend some time with his wife. The idea being that then when she has this baby, people will assume it's Uriah's baby. Maybe that was born premature or something. Well, Uriah doesn't follow that plan. He says to David, "No, I'm not going to go home. All my men are fighting in the battle. I would never just go home," which is a kind of a big slap in David's face because David's been sitting home while the people are fighting. But anyway, Uriah says that, and so the plan doesn't work. So now David, who has been a liar, an adulterer, a manipulator, now becomes a murderer. He sends Uriah back to the battlefield with an instruction letter to his commanding officer, and the commanding officer gets this notice that says, next time there's a fight, next time there's a battle, take Uriah to the front lines and then leave him there and withdraw so that he is killed. I mean, that is the plan given to that military guy, and that's what he does. And Uriah is killed. And so now people probably all think that Uriah had been home, and so then this baby is born, the child is born, and the assumption of everybody is that it's a very tragic thing, that he had this, last time with his wife, and they had a baby, and now he's dead. And Bathsheba goes into mourning for a period of time, and then after that, David brings her into his, to be one of his wives. Whenever I read this story, I have to keep reminding myself, this is David we're talking about, right? This is David, the guy who loved God. This is David, the guy who wrote all these psalms of praise and worship. The hero, one of the big heroes in the Bible, is capable of falling this low. And, that's how sin works, right? One thing leads to another, then leads to another, then leads to another. And pretty soon, you're like, how did I get here? And just very far from God. Now, what's important for this story, and it's important for us to remind ourselves of this, because we don't often think about it, is to think about what happens next after David does this. What happens after that? Nothing. Life just goes on. I mean, for months. The baby is born. I mean, nothing happens. No consequences. The baby's born. She becomes his wife. Life just goes on as usual. David goes about his business. It seems like they've gotten away with it. Like there's no consequences. So months go by. Maybe not years, but certainly months. Many, many months. Everything's fine, it seems like, but of course it's not fine. And we discover that it wasn't fine for David in his heart. Even though he wasn't experiencing outward consequences, something was happening within him. And so out of that experience then, David writes Psalm 32. Because what happens is, again, you know the story, eventually the prophet Nathan confronts David, and David finally comes clean. He breaks down and confesses what he's done, and then he has to face the consequences. And so he writes this psalm, Psalm 32. And he tells us about what it was like living with the fallout of this sin. And so if you have your Bible in front of you, I want to focus especially on the first few verses, because verses 1 and 2 and verses 3 and 4, they set up a contrast. There's pre-confession, post-confession. What life was like before he came clean, what life was like after he came clean. What life was like with the skeletons in the closet, and what life was like after. And it actually starts out by talking about how great it is when there's no skeletons in the closet. So verses 1 and 2, he says, "Blessed is the one whose transgressions are forgiven, whose sins are covered. Blessed is the one whose sin the Lord does not count against them, in whose spirit is no deceit." So people who have a clean slate with God are blessed, which is a word that is kind of lame in the English language. It's a little bit hard to translate. It's like, maybe another way of saying it is, people are well off. People are fortunate. Maybe that's a better literal translation. Fortunate are those. These are the people who have it really good, who have the good life. Those are the people who have their transgressions forgiven. That's what it means. The Lord does not count their sins against them, and that brings huge blessing in their life. In fact, notice that last phrase in verse 2, where he says, "And in whose spirit is no deceit." They don't have to live trying to keep stuff under wraps. They don't have to live with the deceit. And in fact, this is one of the worst parts of guilt. I mean, there's many bad things about it, but part of it is just living with that deceit. So you might remember the story of Kathleen Salia. She was a Minnesotan. She made the news a few years ago because she was living as a fugitive in St. Paul. Her real name was Sarah Jane Olson, and she was finally caught and then convicted of a crime, actually going back to the 70s, after living in St. Paul for many years. Well, before her, there was another woman who was maybe even more famous, and this is Kathleen Salia. And I'm sorry, that was Kathleen Salia. This person is Catherine Powers. And like Salia, she had committed a crime and then lived as a fugitive. And she was living as a fugitive for many years. She was actually on the most wanted list. She had established herself in a new community, had a new identity, tried to put the past behind her, but she couldn't. And unlike Salia, she actually turned herself in. She confessed to her crime, and she actually went to prison for it. Now, do you know why she confessed? It wasn't because what she had done was so hard to live with. It was because she couldn't live with the dishonesty that pervaded her life, trying to cover it up. She said in an interview, "I know that I must answer for this accusation from the past in order to live with full authenticity in the present." And her husband said, well, she just wants to be whole. And that's the problem with guilt. It's not it's the regret, But it's not just the regret, it's also the deceit, the hiding, the sense of dishonesty that we have to live with. We spend our lives wondering what would happen if people found out. Yeah, you like me now. Yeah, you're my friend now. Yeah, you love me, but if you really knew who I am, would you still love me? Would you still want to be my friend? Well, in contrast to verses 1 and 2 then that talk about how great it is to have that be gone, then David talks about what's going on internally, verses 3 and 4, this life of living in deceit. He says in verse 3, when I kept silent, when I kept this to myself, I lived in denial of what I had done. I was miserable. My bones wasted away. My strength was sapped as in the heat of summer. Guilt makes you depressed. It sucks the energy and the joy out of life. People who have skeletons in the closet are robbed of a lot of their energy and joy because of the fear that someday the door is going to fly open and the skeletons are going to get out. And again, you know what's even worse than the experience of the skeletons getting out? It's the life, how life happens before the skeletons get out. If they don't get out, and you're just living with that. Because the internal disequilibrium, the internal struggle, the internal lack of ease, dis-ease, is happening, even if it doesn't come out. And David says before he confessed his sin, he almost couldn't live. He couldn't live with himself. He couldn't live with the incongruity of having this be in his life and also then being the spiritual leader of the Israelite nation. He couldn't live with the duplicity of singing songs of praise, writing songs of praise, and at the same time having this be part of his life. He says, day and night your hand was heavy upon me. I groaned. My strength was sapped as in the heat of summer. Skeletons in the closet, even if they don't get exposed, have a way of messing up the whole house, even if they're kept out of sight. Some years ago, Charlene and I lived in a house that had a big natural fireplace and a chimney. None of that gas business, a real fireplace. And it was great. I love fireplaces. I love natural fireplaces. But this house was in Austin, Texas, where you don't really need a fireplace. It's warm all the time, not all the time, but most of the time. We didn't use it very much. One day, we started to notice a smell in the living room. First, we tried to ignore it. Charlene smelled it before me. She has way more sensitive smell than me. And just tried to ignore it. Thought we were imagining things. Then it got worse. Was it food that we left out somewhere and went bad? Was there a diaper that we changed that got left somewhere? Couldn't find anything. We were using air freshener, burning candles. Still didn't work. Well, finally, I took part of the chimney apart in the back of the house, and lo and behold, there's a dead squirrel there. Denial wasn't going to work. We had to deal with the squirrel, right? Same thing is true with unresolved guilt. Your strategies are not going to work. It doesn't go away. It goes underground. It festers. It gets worse. So what do? We learn from David's experience that freedom from guilt comes from confession, not denial. Forgiveness came when he acknowledged his sin, and this is verse 5, and did not cover up his iniquity. He brought it to God, and then he was freed. And of course, he experienced consequences. That is part of it. When we do things, when we say things, when we perform actions, we're planting seeds. And what we sow, we grow. And so that happens, but that his inner life is transformed. So the word confess literally means to say the same thing as. So when we confess our sins, we're simply agreeing with God about them. We're saying, God, yes, I know that was wrong. I know what your word says and how you feel about it, so I agree with you. I'm sorry. And that's what this psalm, that's what David was doing. And this is an Old Testament psalm with a New Testament message because it looks ahead points ahead to the coming of Christ and the sacrifice that Christ made on the cross. And because of what Christ did, we can be forgiven. We can be cleansed. The sins are not overlooked, they're forgiven. And they're forgiven by a holy and just God because the penalty has been paid because of what Christ did for us. So even in the Old Testament, those sacrifices that they made to atone for sin, they didn't have the power in and of themselves to atone for or cover up offense. They pointed ahead to the coming of Christ and the forgiveness that was made possible through him. That's why we can be forgiven. The point, though, that David is bringing out here in this psalm that I want to emphasize this morning is that we've got to come clean. We've got to acknowledge our guilt, our need for forgiveness. We've got to say the same thing about our lives as God says. And when we do that, we find forgiveness and we find freedom. And that's what David is referring to. If you look at verse 6, he says, "Then when the mighty waters rise, they won't reach the person who's confessed." Waters in the Old Testament, and especially in Psalms, which are like, they're poetry, waters are a symbol. They're used to symbolize chaos and destruction. So mighty waters would be like a tidal wave or a flood that destroys things. And so what David is saying is that when you confess your sins, then you're protected. There's a sense of security in your life. And verse 7 emphasizes the same theme, that God, when this has happened, when the slate is clean, then God shelters us, God protects us. The spiritual life becomes a secure place in our lives instead of being yet another thing to worry about. And I wonder this morning how many of us have something in our lives that we need to confess, that we haven't yet brought to the light. And if that's the case, I guarantee it's robbing you of joy. It's terrible to live in fear of this thing coming out. So I'm going to invite you to bring that to God. And if you have your bulletin there, please turn it over, and you will find there's something that you can fill out. And at the top, you see these words about confession. It says, most people have trouble removing the proverbial skeleton from their closet. They find that it's far more stubborn than they expected. There's a good reason for trying a solution a bit more serious than a quick prayer at the end of the day. Lord, forgive me, please. I messed up again. Sorry about that, okay? Just want to cover my tail in case I don't wake up tomorrow. All right, thanks. That would be one thing, one way of doing it, but we want to get a little more honest and a little more clear. Skeletons don't enter people's closets without some personal involvement on the owner's part. So you need to confess what you've done and treat what happened as a serious matter. And so then the rest is a place with fill in the blanks. Now, you could do it this morning, but it might be a little weird if there's people right around you looking over your shoulder. But so maybe you do it later today or tonight. So you fill out this statement of confession. I'm frightened because of needing to confess the sin of, and then write it down. Be specific. And by the way, I'm going to encourage you to destroy it afterwards, burn it, whatever. Because you don't want to censor yourself because someone might see it. Be honest. Be honest with yourself and be honest with God. Jesus, I'm making an appeal for mercy from you because of, and then you go, my reasons for wanting to be forgiven. Think of, what's going on in your life. Thank you for scriptures that encourage me. And then you can write down any verses like 1 John 1:9. That verse says if we confess our sins, God is faithful and just to forgive us and cleanse us from righteousness. So it's great to be able to write down a verse like that and have that reminder, that promise. What I believe your forgiveness can do for me is, what is that? What would that be? Restore the joy that I used to know. Give me a sense of peace. Help me to be the person you want me to be, whatever. And I receive your forgiveness and express my thanks in these words. And then you can write that down. In the future, I want to be a better friend to you, and so I want to. And then if there's any kind of new commitment that you want to make, write that down. And then sign your confession and date it. And then this is the most important part. Then you turn it into a prayer. You pray that back to God. And then the second most important part is you burn it. And then see if you don't experience freedom and joy and release like David talks about in Psalm 32.